The morning sun reflected off the glass towers of Nexus Technologies headquarters, casting geometric shadows across the rooftop helipad where Victoria Chen stood in her tailored Armani suit, pointing at the company's executive helicopter with a perfectly manicured finger. James Mitchell was emptying the trash bins near the rooftop entrance when he heard her voice cut through the wind, sharp and mocking, directed at him with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never been told no in her entire privileged life. "You there, janitor. Come here." James set down the waste bag and walked toward where Victoria stood with three of her executive team members, all of them holding champagne flutes at 10 in the morning, celebrating some acquisition or merger that would make them richer, while the people who cleaned their offices struggled to pay rent. Victoria gestured toward the sleek black helicopter behind her, its rotors still and silent against the Texas sky. "I'll make you a deal. If you can fly this helicopter, if you can take it up and bring it down without killing yourself, I'll marry you. Right here. Right now." Her colleagues laughed, the kind of laughter that comes from people who think punching down is the same thing as humor. "Come on, Victoria. That's cruel even for you," one of them said, still smiling. Victoria's eyes never left James. "I'm completely serious. This man clearly thinks he's capable of more than pushing a mop. So let's give him a chance to prove it. Fly my helicopter, and you can have everything I have. My position, my wealth, me." She said the last word like it was the greatest prize anyone could imagine. James stood there holding an empty trash bag, his dark blue maintenance uniform worn soft from washing, looking at this woman who thought his life was a joke worth wagering on. And for the first time in 3 years, something shifted behind his carefully maintained composure. If that opening just grabbed you by the throat, if you're already feeling the injustice and anticipating the moment when everything this CEO thinks she knows gets shattered into pieces, then you need to hit that like button right now. Share this with everyone who's ever been underestimated based on their job title or the color of their skin. Subscribe to Acts of Depth because we tell the stories about the exact moment when assumptions collide with reality, when arrogance meets humility, when someone who's been invisible reveals they've been hiding in plain sight all along. Now let me take you back to understand exactly who James Mitchell was before he became the man emptying trash bins on Victoria Chen's rooftop, because that context makes what happens next hit like thunder. James Mitchell had been the best helicopter pilot in the United States military. Not one of the best. The best. He'd logged over 4,000 flight hours in Blackhawks, completing 273 combat missions across 3 deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq. He'd flown medical evacuations under fire, extracted special forces teams from hot landing zones, and once kept a damaged helicopter in the air for 40 minutes with a bullet hole in the fuel line and a dying engine, landing safely on a carrier deck in pitch darkness with zero visibility. His commanding officers had called him a natural, but James knew it wasn't natural talent. It was obsessive practice, relentless study, and the kind of focus that came from understanding that other people's lives depended on his ability to make the right decision in the 3 seconds between crisis and catastrophe. He'd been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 Bronze Stars, and the Air Medal with Valor. His personnel file was filled with commendations that used words like exceptional and heroic and once-in-a-generation skill. And then on a January morning in the Helmand province, his entire world had shattered in the space of 7 seconds. The mission had been routine. Extract a team of Marines from a forward position before a Taliban offensive arrived. James had done the same type of extraction 100 times before. But intelligence had been wrong about enemy positions. And as James brought the Black Hawk down to pick up the Marines, an RPG had come out of nowhere. He'd seen it in his peripheral vision, had tried to pull up, had almost made it. The rocket-propelled grenade had struck the tail rotor assembly, and the helicopter had started spinning, the world becoming a blur of sky and desert and the faces of his crew knowing they were about to die. James had fought the controls with everything he had, managing to keep the helicopter from going into an uncontrolled spiral, managing to bring it down hard but survivable. He'd walked away from the crash with a concussion and a broken wrist. His co-pilot, his crew chief, and his door gunner had not walked away at all. 3 men he'd flown with for 2 years. Three men with families and futures. Three men who trusted him to bring them home. The investigation had cleared James of any wrongdoing. The official report had actually praised his emergency piloting for preventing a total catastrophe. But James knew the truth that the report couldn't capture. He'd been 3 seconds too slow in his reaction time. 3 seconds that he'd spent double-checking his instruments instead of trusting his instincts. 3 seconds that had cost 3 lives. The guilt had eaten him from the inside. He tried to continue flying, but every time he sat in a cockpit, the faces of his dead crew would appear in his mind and his hands would start shaking. The Army had offered him therapy, desk positions, honorable discharge with full benefits. James had taken the discharge and spent the next year trying to figure out how to live in a world where he couldn't do the one thing that had defined his entire adult life. He drifted through jobs that felt meaningless. Security work, delivery driving, consulting for defense contractors who wanted his expertise but not his damaged psyche. Nothing stuck because nothing mattered when you'd lost the thing that gave your life purpose. Then his grandmother had called him home to Houston, to the small house where he'd grown up, and she'd said something that had shifted his perspective just enough to keep breathing. Baby, you're punishing yourself by trying to be someone you're not anymore. You can't be the pilot you were. That man died in that crash with those boys. But you can be someone new, someone humble enough to start over, someone brave enough to choose peace over glory. So James had taken a job as a custodian at Nexus Technologies because it was the opposite of everything he'd been. No life or death decisions. No one depending on him for their survival. Just floors to mop and trash to empty, and 8 hours of physical work that let his mind rest for the first time in years. He'd been working there for 14 months when Victoria Chen had inherited the CEO position from her father and had started treating the maintenance staff like they were scenery instead of people. Victoria Chen had never worked a day in her life before becoming CEO. Her father, Robert Chen, had built Nexus Technologies from a garage startup into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise over 30 years, and he tried to teach his daughter about the business from the ground up. But Victoria had been more interested in the lifestyle that came with wealth than the work that created it. She'd gone to Yale because her father had donated a library. She'd gotten an MBA from Harvard because her father had endowed a chair in her name. And when Robert Chen had suffered a massive stroke that left him unable to run the company, the board had appointed Victoria as CEO, not because she'd earned it, but because keeping the founder's family in power was good optics, and because they assumed they could control a figurehead who didn't understand the technical side of the business. Victoria had surprised them by being ruthless in exactly the ways that benefited herself. She'd cut costs by eliminating middle management positions and workers' benefits. She'd increased executive compensation, including her own salary, while freezing wages for everyone else. And she'd cultivated an image as a young, bold leader who wasn't afraid to make tough decisions, when what she really was someone who'd never experienced the consequences of being on the receiving end of those decisions. She treated the maintenance staff, the cafeteria workers, the security guards, like they were invisible, didn't learn their names, didn't acknowledge them when they cleaned her office or served her lunch. And on the rare occasions when she did interact with them, it was with the kind of condescension that came from someone who genuinely believed some people were just worth more than others. James had watched Victoria for 14 months, had seen how she treated people, had emptied the trash in her office, and heard the way she talked about employees like they were expenses to be minimized rather than human beings contributing to the company's success. He'd stayed silent because silence was part of his self-imposed penance, because he'd told himself that his opinion didn't matter anymore, that he'd lost the right to judge others when he'd failed his own crew. But standing on that rooftop, listening to her offer marriage as a prize for a humiliating stunt, something in James's carefully constructed armor cracked. He looked at Victoria Chen in her expensive suit, surrounded by her equally expensive friends, and he made a decision that he hadn't allowed himself to make in 3 years. He decided to stop hiding. "I accept your offer," James said, his voice carrying across the rooftop with the kind of quiet authority that made everyone stop laughing. Victoria's expression shifted from amused to confused. "I'm sorry, what?" "Your offer. I'll fly your helicopter. And when I do, you'll honor your word about the marriage." James kept his eyes locked on Victoria's, watching her realize that he was serious. "This is ridiculous," one of her executives said. "Victoria, you can't actually let him do this. The liability alone." But Victoria had that look in her eyes that rich people get when they think they're about to teach someone a lesson. "No, no, I made an offer. Let's see if our custodian here has the skills to match his confidence. But we'll need to make this official. Andrew, call the lawyers. Draw up a contract. If he crashes my helicopter, he covers all damages. If he actually manages to fly it without killing himself, then we'll discuss the terms of our arrangement." She turned back to James. "Do you even know how to start a helicopter?" James walked past Victoria toward the helicopter, his worn work boots making soft sounds against the rooftop surface. He did his pre-flight check from muscle memory, his hands moving over the aircraft with the kind of familiarity that came from thousands of hours of practice. He checked the rotor head for damage, inspected the tail boom, examined the skids, tested the collective and cyclic controls through the open door. Every movement was precise and professional, and James could feel the shift in energy behind him as the executives realized this wasn't going to be the comedy show they had expected. "He knows what he's doing," someone whispered. Victoria's voice had lost some of its mocking edge. "Where did you learn that?" James didn't answer. He climbed into the pilot's seat and started the engine sequence. The turbine began to whine, building to the familiar roar that James had both missed and dreaded for 3 years. The rotor began to turn, slowly at first, then faster, the characteristic whop, whop, whop of the blades cutting through air. James had forgotten how it felt to sit in a cockpit again, how the vibration of the machine became an extension of your body, how the instrument panel in front of you was like reading a language only you fully understood. His hands weren't shaking. For the first time since the crash, his hands were completely steady on the controls. He looked out at Victoria through the cockpit window and gave her a small nod. Then he lifted off. The helicopter rose smoothly, James's touch on the collective and cyclic so refined that the ascent looked effortless. He took the aircraft up 200 feet, held it in a perfect hover for 5 seconds that felt like an eternity to everyone watching, then executed a movement that made every jaw on that rooftop drop. He performed a combat spiral, a tactical maneuver used to evade ground fire, bringing the helicopter through a tight corkscrew descent that required absolute mastery of the controls and spatial awareness that bordered on supernatural. He came out of the spiral at 50 feet, transitioned into forward flight, circled the building once at speed, then brought the helicopter back to the helipad and set it down with such precision that the skids touched the surface at exactly the same moment with barely a bump. He shut down the engine, let the rotors wind down to a stop, and climbed out of the cockpit. The rooftop was completely silent except for the sound of the cooling turbine. James walked back to where Victoria stood, her champagne glass forgotten in her hand, her expression showing something that might have been shock or embarrassment, or the first stirrings of understanding that she'd miscalculated badly. "That offer still stand?" James asked. Victoria opened her mouth, but no sound came out immediately. One of her executives, the one who tried to talk her out of the bet, stepped forward. "That was military flying. Who the hell are you?" James pulled out his phone and brought up a photo, turning the screen so they could all see it. The image showed him in his army dress uniform, his chest covered in medals, standing next to a Black Hawk with his crew. Captain James Mitchell, retired, formerly of the 101st Airborne Division, 3 combat deployments, 273 missions, Distinguished Flying Cross. "I was flying helicopters while you were all learning to drive cars." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when reality fundamentally shifts and people need a moment to adjust to the new landscape. Victoria was staring at the photo like it was written in a language she couldn't quite read. "You're a decorated military pilot and you're working as a janitor? That doesn't make any sense." James put his phone away. "It makes perfect sense if you understand that job titles don't define worth. I clean floors because I chose to clean floors. Because after I lost my crew in a crash, I needed to do something that didn't put other people's lives at risk. Because being a custodian meant I could be useful without being responsible for life and death. You looked at me and saw someone beneath you. Someone whose life could be a joke. But I was never beneath you. I was just invisible to you because you've never learned to see people as anything other than their utility to your world. He took a step closer to Victoria, and she actually backed up slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that she'd been wrong in ways she was only beginning to understand. You offered to marry me if I could fly your helicopter. I flew your helicopter better than probably anyone else in this city could. So either you honor your word, or you admit that your word means nothing when it's given to someone you consider beneath you. Victoria's face had gone through several shades of pale. I didn't. This was supposed to be a joke. I never thought you'd actually be able to. You never thought a black janitor could be a decorated military officer? You never thought someone who empties your trash could have more qualifications than you do? You never thought that maybe, just maybe, the people you ignore and condescend to might have entire lives and histories that you know nothing about? James's voice stayed level, but the words landed like punches. One of the executives stepped forward, a woman in her 50s who'd been watching the whole exchange with an expression that had shifted from entertainment to discomfort to something like recognition. Captain Mitchell, I'm Sandra Williams, COO of this company. I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding here, and I'd like to apologize on behalf of Nexus Technologies for the way you've been treated. Victoria shot her a look, but Sandra ignored it. Victoria, I think you need to acknowledge what just happened. You made a public bet. You lost. And more importantly, you revealed that you've been treating a decorated veteran, someone who served this country with distinction, like he was invisible because he's doing honest work. That reflects very poorly on you and on this company. Victoria's face had gone from pale to flushed. Sandra, you can't be serious. This whole thing is absurd. I'm not going to marry a janitor because of some stupid bet made in jest. Then you're admitting your word means nothing, James said quietly, which is important information for your board and shareholders to have. But this was never really about marriage. This was about respect, about you learning that the person cleaning your office might have sacrificed more for this country than you'll ever contribute to anything, that he might have skills and experiences that would humble you if you ever bothered to see him as a human being instead of scenery. He turned to walk away, then stopped. I'll be resigning my custodian position effective immediately, not because you humiliated yourself today, but because I realized something while flying your helicopter. I've been punishing myself by staying small, by staying invisible, by choosing work that kept me from the thing I'm actually good at. And you've been hiding behind wealth and position you didn't earn, treating people badly because you've never had to face consequences. We're both stuck, but at least now I'm choosing to get unstuck. The next 48 hours became a case study in how quickly public perception can shift when a story goes viral. Someone on that rooftop had been recording the entire exchange on their phone. By that evening, the video had been posted anonymously online with the caption, CEO challenges janitor to fly helicopter, instantly regrets it. By the next morning, it had 30 million views. The story made national news. James Mitchell's military record was uncovered and reported. The contrast between his distinguished service and his choice to work as a janitor created a narrative that resonated with millions of people who'd ever been underestimated or dismissed based on superficial judgments. News outlets ran profiles about Captain James Mitchell, the decorated pilot who'd survived combat only to struggle with PTSD and survivor's guilt, who'd chosen humble work as a path to healing. Veterans groups celebrated him as an example of the challenges soldiers faced reintegrating into civilian life. And Victoria Chen became the face of everything people hated about wealthy executives who'd never worked for anything but acted like they'd earned the right to look down on others. The backlash was severe and immediate. Nexus Technologies' stock dropped 8% as investors worried about leadership that showed such poor judgment. Major clients started asking questions about the company's values and workplace culture. And the board of directors, which had tolerated Victoria's leadership because she'd been profitable, suddenly found themselves in crisis management mode. They called an emergency meeting 72 hours after the rooftop incident. Victoria was asked to attend. The boardroom felt different this time. Usually when Victoria walked in, people stood or at least acknowledged her position with deference. Today, they
chairman,
barely
a
looked up
man
from the
named Harold
documents in front
Chen,
of them, who was Victoria's uncle and had been one of her supporters in the succession fight, spoke without preamble. Victoria, you've created a public relations disaster that's costing this company real money. More importantly, you've exposed a culture of disrespect toward employees that violates everything this company was supposed to stand for when your father built it. Victoria tried to defend herself. It was a joke that got blown out of proportion. I never intended to humiliate anyone. And the media has turned this into something it wasn't. Sandra Williams, the COO who'd witnessed the rooftop exchange, slid a folder across the table. We've been conducting an internal review since the incident. This folder contains 17 complaints from custodial staff, cafeteria workers, and security personnel describing instances where you've treated them dismissively, refused to learn their names, or made comments suggesting you considered them less valuable than executive employees. James Mitchell isn't an isolated case. He's just the one who had the skills to publicly demonstrate how wrong your assumptions were. The folder sat in the middle of the table like an accusation. Harold Chen leaned forward. The board has voted. You're being removed as CEO effective immediately. You'll retain your position as a board member and shareholder, but operational control of the company is being transferred to Sandra. We're also implementing mandatory respect and inclusion training for all executive staff, and we're conducting a comprehensive review of how we treat our workers across all departments. Victoria sat in stunned silence. You can't do this. This company is my inheritance. My father built it for me. Harold's expression was somewhere between sympathy and disappointment. Your father built it for everyone. He built it on principles of innovation and respect for the people who made the innovation possible. You forgot that. Or maybe you never learned it. Either way, the damage you've done to this company's reputation in 3 days exceeds anything you've accomplished in your entire tenure. The board's decision is final. Victoria left the boardroom feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. She'd lost her position, lost her authority, lost the thing she'd spent her whole life assuming was hers by right. And for the first time in her privileged existence, she was being forced to consider that maybe, just maybe, she'd been wrong about fundamental things. 3 days later, she did something she'd never done before in her life. She looked up James Mitchell's contact information and asked if they could meet. He agreed, suggesting a coffee shop near his grandmother's house. When Victoria arrived, wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of her usual designer armor, James was already sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee waiting. He'd ordered her usual without having to ask, which surprised her until she remembered he'd cleaned her office for 14 months and had probably emptied her coffee cups enough times to know exactly how she took it. They sat in awkward silence for a moment before Victoria finally found words. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the way I treated you, and for the assumptions I made, and for being the kind of person who thought it was acceptable to mock someone just because they had a job I considered beneath me. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to hear me say it. James wrapped his hands around his coffee cup and looked at Victoria with an expression that wasn't angry or triumphant, just tired in a way that suggested he'd seen enough pain in his life to understand that most people were doing their best with the tools they had been given. I accept your apology, but I need you to understand something. What you did on that rooftop wasn't just about me. It was about a culture that says some work is dignified and some work is shameful, that some people deserve respect and some people have to earn it. I've flown combat missions where the people who packed my parachute and maintained my aircraft were just as critical to the mission as I was. Maybe more critical, because if they failed at their jobs, I died. Every job in a functioning organization matters. The person who cleans the floors is as essential as the person in the corner office. When you mock the janitor, you're saying his labor has no value. And when enough people in power believe that, you end up with a society where workers are treated as disposable. Victoria listened with the kind of attention she'd never given anyone before, and something in her expression suggested the words were landing. I grew up with everything handed to me, she said quietly. I never had to think about what it meant to work for something or to be dismissed because of assumptions about who I was. And I became the thing I hate most in other people, Someone who used power to make herself feel important by making others feel small. She met James's eyes. I'm not going to pretend that one conversation fixes what I've been my whole life, but I'm asking you to help me understand how to be different, how to build a company culture that actually values people. You saw the problems because you were on the receiving end of them. I need that perspective if I'm going to do better. James studied Victoria for a long moment, looking for signs of performance or manipulation, seeing only someone who was genuinely lost and asking for direction. You start by doing the work, not the CEO work, the actual work. You want to understand the people in your company. Spend time in their world. Work a week on the custodial team, a week in the cafeteria, a week in security. Learn their names, hear their stories, understand what they deal with every day. Then use your position and resources to make those jobs better. Higher wages, better benefits, respect in how they're treated and spoken to. He paused. And you need to tell your story too, not the story you want people to believe about how you've always been capable and deserving. The real story about inheriting power you didn't earn and how that blinded you to things that should have been obvious. People respect vulnerability more than they respect perfection. Victoria nodded slowly. Will you help me? Not as an employee, as a consultant. I'll pay whatever you ask. I need someone who won't be afraid to tell me when I'm falling back into old patterns. James considered the offer. I'll help, but not for money. I'll help because I believe people can change if they're willing to do the hard work of looking at themselves honestly. And because maybe helping you become the kind of leader this company deserves is a way for me to use my experience for something that matters. They shook hands across the coffee table, two people from completely different worlds finding common ground in the recognition that both of them had been hiding from who they could become.